Hello, friends. Mr. Flynn here. I hate to keep repeating the same message, but I hope that you're all healthy and happy and doing really well. I'm going to talk a little bit about the chemistry of the brain today and what happens inside the brain when neurons fire, action potential occurs, and neurotransmitters move throughout the brain. Now, don't worry about a lot of these terms. I'm not going to ask you a lot of these specific terms. Like, for example, I'm never going to ask you to name the 7 main neurotransmitters. I'm never going to ask you what the acronym GABA stands for, or those kind of things. So don't get bogged down in the terminology. I'm just exposing you to a lot of this stuff. When you go to first year psych, if you choose to take a first year psychology class, and I realize that our class is a 3C, 3U split, but some of you in the 3C, you may go and get a college diploma or certificate and then go off to university. Lots of people do that. I know some of you are considering nursing, for example. Some of you are considering psychology. Some of you are considering education. You're going to encounter some of these things. So exposure to these things, I think, is really great. Before I move into the lesson about what I'm going to talk about with the brain, I'm also going to talk about drugs today. So it's a little bit of a touchy thing. So I want to make sure that you understand what happens inside the brain to the best of my understanding. So some things about the previous video on the crash course video. Phineas Gage is mentioned in more detail than he was in the PowerPoint that I provided. And I also really liked what the crash course video did with regard to the regions of the brain, the functionality of the brain, and so on. I think they do a really good job, maybe better than I do. They're professional presenters, so I'm doing my best here. Okay, also a caveat. When I talk to you about the chemistry of the brain, I am not a science teacher. So the science teachers at Bernie Custis and probably anywhere else in the world would do a better job at explaining the biochemistry that I am explaining. And I'm doing my best. I'm hoping I'm not going to make any mistakes. Mr. Gupa or any other biology teacher at the school, probably any other science teacher, could probably explain it better than I do. So apologies if I'm sort of not clear, but I'm doing my very best. Okay, so you've already learned about the structure of the brain. So you've learned about, for example, the brain is in 2 hemispheres, right? Kind of looks like a peach if you look at it from the top. In each of the hemispheres, you turn left to the side. Each of the hemispheres, so this would be the side of the brain, has 4 lobes, right? So the frontal lobe, actually that'll be my occiput over there. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and then the occipital lobe. This is hard to do in reverse in the camera. By the way, how do you like the quarantine beard? No? Yay? You can reply in some comments if I should shave the beard or not. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the chemistry of the brain. So what I was just talking about was the physical nature of the brain. Now I'm talking about the actual chemistry of the brain. So what happens inside that matter that we were talking about in the cerebrum and to a lesser extent the cerebellum. So the first thing that I need to understand is that the brain is made up of billions of neurons, not hundreds of thousands or 100,000 or millions, billions of neurons. The neurons range in size. Some of them are so short as to be almost measured in micrometers, and then some are so long to go the entire length of your body, right? So as long as your leg kind of thing. So a few terms to kind of throw at you, okay? So picture the brain, that gray matter. Within that gray matter are cells, right? Just like any other kind of cells. Like you have skin cells, you have bone cells, you have hair cells, blood cells, and so on. And right now we're talking about a specific kind of cell that's related to the CNS, the central nervous system, which are neurons. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about neurons, and please forgive my terrible diagrams. Also, Crash Course does a really good job at this as well. I just don't want to keep throwing Crash Course videos at you, but they do a good job at this as well. So I think it's Crash Course video number 5 or 6, I forget which one it is, but you can go take a look at it. But I've drawn for us some amazing diagrams using my Michelangelo art level skills. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk to you about is this, and I'm hoping that it's not reversed, but it looks a little reversed on mine, but I hope it's not. So I've labeled it, but even if you can't read it, you'll be able to listen along. So what we're talking about here in its entirety is the neuron, okay? So this right here is what we call the soma, or the body of the neuron cell. So the word soma, S-O-M-A, is the Greek word for body. That's why, for example, they ever do a cheek swab. You see that in CSI films. They'll do like a cheek swab, those kind of things. What they're collecting are what we call somatic cells, or body cells, right? So whenever you hear the word soma, it just means the same thing. It just means body every single time. It's like the Latin word corpus, right? So remember the thing that connects the two hemispheres of the brain is the corpus callosum. Well, corpus is just the Latin word for body. That's why we have in English, we call it a corpse, unfortunately, a deceased person, right? So this is the soma, or the body of the cell. And then these here are called the dendrites. And these are from the Greek word for a tree. If you remember back when we were talking about dating techniques, we talked about dendrochronology. So Chronos being the old god of Greek time kind of thing, or the Greek god of time, pardon me. So chronology is the study of time, and dendrochronology is using trees to study time, right? So counting the tree rings and then dating back from tree rings with different widths of each ring and the formation of each ring and how they're similar from year to year for each tree. Okay, so basically this entire thing is called a neuron. Okay, so that's the soma of the neuron, the dendrites, and then traveling down here we have what's known as the axon. Okay, and then this axon, each of these, not that I've labeled it here, but these are called the axon terminus. So basically, here's what happens, okay? Info comes into the cell, whatever that information is. So let's say, for example, you touch something and you feel that it has a particular texture. Or a good example, right? So you touch my hot tea. I have my tea right here, and it's quite hot to the touch. My fingers sense that heat. That sends information in, and that begins what we call an action potential. And what happens is the neuron fires, kind of like a cannon, right? So bam! And it actually kind of looks like that. If you see it on a scan, it kind of looks like that. When the neurons are firing, it's like a whole bunch of like flashes, like almost like camera photography, if you ever see one of the scans. And what happens is it will release a neurotransmitter. I'm going to get to neurotransmitters in just 1 second, but just kind of hear me out. And it released, now I'm going to throw some words in here you don't need to know, but just kind of run along with me. So it will release a neurochemical. Oops, sorry, I forgot my prop, so I'm just getting it now. It'll release a neurochemical in something that kind of resembles a plastic baggie. Okay, it's called a synaptic vesicle. Little plastic baggies of this neurotransmitter, which travel from the cell, down the axon, all the way down to an axon terminus and smash. So try and picture like a water balloon, right? You've all probably had a water balloon fight. Same kind of thing. It has like a little baggie of this neurotransmitter chemical. It travels down the axon, hits the end of the axon terminus, and it smashes. And I'm going to tell you what happens after that on my next beautifully drawn diagram. You have to take a look. Okay, so neurotransmitters. There are lots of chemicals in your body that do a lot of different things. If I asked you to try and name a neurochemical, could you name one now? I'll wait for a second and see if you can name one. I don't know how dramatic that is, but if you came up with serotonin or dopamine, then you've named a neurochemical. Some people would also say adrenaline. We actually, that's norepinephrine or sometimes epinephrine, but adrenaline is a common name for what is a neurochemical, which stimulates that fight or flight response. That's the quickened heart rate. That's the perspiration that occurs. That's the blood movement increase in your body, right? Preparing your body for fight or flight. So I've written them down here just so that I can remember them all. I don't have them memorized, so forgive me. So acetylcholine, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, GABA, which is an acronym. You can look up what that means. I don't even know off the top of my head. Glutamate and endorphin. Okay, so at the end of this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of those neurochemicals kind of do if they're in the wrong amounts, which is going to bridge us into abnormal psychology. Okay, so that's the neuron, that's the soma of the neuron, the dendrites, the axon, all the way down the axon terminus. I talked to you about action potential. I talked to you about the synaptic vesicles running all the way along, and then bursting like a water balloon at the end of the axon terminus, releasing the neurochemical. Okay, and I'm going to show you what happens in the next step. One final bit, a lot of nerve cells, not all, but a lot of nerve cells have like a coating around them, almost like an insulation. It's called a myelin sheath. You'll never need to know that from my class. I just want to introduce it to you, and you can have it kind of rumbling around in your brain. When you get off to first year psych, you're going to hear about myelin sheath, and you're also going to hear about some diseases. I believe it's multiple sclerosis. Don't quote me on that, but I believe it's multiple sclerosis that corrodes this myelin sheath around nerve cells, and that is obviously has catastrophic effects. But that's outside of our purview of study. We're not learning about that in class. But I just want to kind of mention the myelin sheath and so you have some kind of information on that. Okay, on to my next beautiful bit of artwork. So we were at the neuron. The neuron had fired, it had taken a neurochemical, it had released it in a synaptic vesicle, it had traveled down the axon, down to the axon terminus, it smashes against that, and it releases the liquid just like a water balloon. And when it does that, this is what happens. So what I have here are two neurons. I've got one neuron here and one neuron there. And when this gets some information here in the dendrites, it triggers that action potential. And when it does that, the neurochemical travels down the axon and bam. Now, good sound effect, right? Anyway, so right here at that dendrite, or pardon me, at that axon terminus, right, it abuts up against another neuron, and there is its dendrite. Okay, now those kind of fibrous tissues kind of come together really super close, but not close enough to touch, but so close that when they were first studying these kind of things, they thought that they were all connected. They couldn't figure out what was happening, and now because of basically methods we can use to scan the brain, microscopy and so on, and things that have advanced, we know that they don't actually touch. That's how close they are. And the difference between the two of those things is called a synaptic gap. Now, this is how information is transmitted in your brain to a degree, right? So these neurochemicals, remember the hot tea that I touched, it's going to trigger the action potential here, it's going to travel down here, and that little baggie, that synaptic vesicle, when it bursts, it releases that neurotransmitter, that chemical, and that chemical bridges that gap. It's called a synaptic gap. Okay, so this is your synapse firing, and bam, and when that happens, information is being transferred to this neuron, and on it goes. So when you want to pick up a cup of coffee, that is a whole bunch of neurons firing, trying to tell all of your muscles, your nerves, and your sensory nerves and so on and so forth to deal with that situation that you're requiring. So these neurotransmitters are usually broken down into two. You don't really need to know these, but I will say, for example, there are usually excitatory and inhibitory. So things that make you kind of ramp up and things that kind of chill you out and ramp down. Now, when I say you, what I really mean is the neuron. So if it relieves an inhibitory neurotransmitter, it tells the neuron to kind of relax a little bit, and that has a relaxing effect. Excitatory, so norepinephrine, as an example, right, is excitatory, right, as I just mentioned a little while ago when I was talking. An inhibitory one is one, for example, called like serotonin, right? So serotonin, for all intents and purposes, is connected to a lot of functions, but also connected to sleep. Now, they say that the wrong levels of serotonin are connected to certain forms of depression, which is why we have some drugs which will change the levels of serotonin in the brain back to what levels perhaps would not create a depressive state. Now, I want to pause for a second, just talk about depression. We're going to get into this when we talk about abnormal psychology. I'm also going to tell you why they use the word abnormal, but basically, depression isn't only chemical. So if you have depression, if you know somebody that does have depression, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have different levels of serotonin. There are different types of depression, and I'm not qualified to diagnose that, nor am I really qualified to talk about that here. I will say that not everybody that has depression has the wrong levels of serotonin or dopamine, and I will also say that not all depression is the same, okay? So, and a lot of people feel depression. Okay, now I'm going to get right down to like the bare bones. Okay, so remember this picture, and remember that right there, the two, like that synaptic gap. Okay, so picture that like I've blown that up, and then that's this. Okay, so hopefully, I don't know why it's reversed on my screen, but I'm just going to keep reading and see how we do. So that's the axon terminus, and then you can see I've drawn like these little baggies, synaptic vesicles with the neurotransmitters in them. They're traveling down this direction. They're traveling down. They're going to hit. They're going to smash like a water balloon. And hopefully you can see I've drawn the little orange dots, right? That's going to be my splash of neurotransmitter. And then these blue things are what we call receptor sites. So what happens in a healthy firing is, I'm going to show you my next slide, but basically it bridges the synaptic gap. You can see there's a gap between this axon terminus here and this dendrite of the next neuron, okay? And this right here is the synaptic gap. It bridges the gap. So in a very quick motion, it comes down, touches on the receptors, and then goes back up into the axon, okay? It's called reuptake, okay? So now I'm going to talk to you really quickly about drugs and opioids as a specific example, okay? And why no one should ever consider doing any illegal street drug, right? So I know we use opioids in medicine. You should use opioids as sparingly as possible and only when prescribed by any physician, and follow it to the letter. It's highly addictive, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, again, I'm not an expert. I'm going to try and explain it the best that I understand it. If I get this a little wrong, or if there's a bit of a tweak, I think that I'm a bit excused because I'm close enough to give us kind of an understanding. Okay, I'm not a chemist, I'm not a biologist. Okay, so again, apologies. I hope Mr. Gupta can call me and correct me on my wrong stuff. Okay, so what we have here is, now I'm using metaphor. Okay, so don't think for a second that neurotransmitters are shaped like this. I'm using a metaphor. I'm just using Tetris as an example, right, to try and illustrate what I'm trying to say. Okay, so this is a receptor site. This is a healthy neurotransmitter. So dopamine, serotonin, GABA, glutamate, doesn't matter which one we're talking about, but let's just hypothetically say that it has a shape. What I really mean is a chemical signature. It has a very specific chemical signature that this specific receptor is designed to receive. Okay, so there are serotonin receptors, dopamine receptors, and so on and so forth. Okay, there are other types of receptors too, but we don't really need to know all that stuff. What we do need to understand, though, is that what happens is the neurotransmitter comes down, touches on the receptor site, and then goes back up and reuptake. And when it does that, that's what passes along the message. So picture like your brother or your sister or your cousin or something like that. You're in the back of a car on a long trip, and you're like, not touching me, not touching me, not touching me, not touching me, and all of a sudden, touch. As soon as you've done that and pull your finger away, that's kind of what happens here. Same kind of process. And that touch transfers information. In this case, the fact that your sibling or cousin is bothering you. Now, opioids are a bit strange because what happens is they come down and they bind to opioid receptors. And when they do that, they actually start to physically change the shape, the metaphorical shape of the receptor site. Not change it that way, but it alters the biochemistry of this particular receptor. And when it does that, I'm going to throw some chemistry at you here. I'm sorry. And again, I hope I get this right. It basically promotes something called, it promotes calcium conductance, promotes potassium conductance, I believe, and reduces calcium conductance. What that means is the axon is less likely to fire. In other words, we're slowing down neurons in the brain. That's not what we want. We use our entire brain for almost everything. Even just walking, the entire brain lights up on a scan. So when we're using opioids and we're slowing down the action potential, in other words, neurons aren't firing as quickly, then that means we're kind of slowing down what the brain is capable of and reducing its productivity, if you will. I hope that's a good metaphor. The other thing that it does is it increases dopamine levels. And it increases dopamine levels in a particular way that it, for example, decreases anxiety, increases euphoria, increases confidence, and of course, and all the myriad effects that other opioids have, okay? The message here is that these drugs are catastrophic partially because they change the chemistry of the brain. When you change the neurochemistry of the brain, you're playing with fire, right? So anything that's going to change the neurochemistry of the brain is not going to be a good thing. Okay, I know I've thrown a lot of science at you today, and I hope that I've gotten it right. And I got to apologize for how nerdy my videos are. I'm doing my best here. I don't have a whiteboard. And I'm also trying to not rely exclusively on YouTube videos, right? I'm trying to provide some instruction for you that comes from me, a little bit personalized and so on. If you have any questions or comments, I want you to continue to use the comment section, that one-to-one conversation space I created in the hub, or you can email me, as many of you are, which is great. Stay in touch, stay in contact. Now, the last couple of minutes of this video are just going to be for your mental health. So I've gotten a couple of responses from students saying that you're pretty stressed during this time. It's very normal and natural. That you are not dealing with like the flood of things coming at you. That is also very normal and natural. So some things that, and by the way, I am not a trained psychologist or any. I'm just a balding middle-aged social studies teacher, so social sciences teacher. So I'm going to do my best to give you my advice. Again, I'm not medically trained. I'm just going to share some things that have helped for me. Number one has been exercise. So whatever your exercise is, for me, I run a little bit, so I'm trying to get out and just run. It's an individual sport, so I'm not around anybody. I'm still maintaining social distance. Like I was telling a student today, I like to run on the path on Cannon Street, the bike path. It's relatively safe because it's a bike path. There are no other humans around. Cyclists kind of can go by me, but they go by me kind of at a wide arc, and it's great. Very few cyclists out right now, so that's actually, it's okay for me to use that path fairly safely. I'm also doing like body strength stuff, so push-ups and sit-ups and that kind of thing, although we should be doing more, and I'm not, but I'm trying. If you have stairs in your home, then go up and down the stairs many, many, many times, right? And challenge yourself to increase the number of times you can go up and down the stairs in a day. It's going to drive somebody nuts, so don't do it when people are sleeping, but you get the idea, like get some exercise. Number two, go on YouTube and check out some yoga. And I'm going to leave the spiritual side of it aside, because I'm not a spiritual person. I don't say namaste or stuff like that. But the yoga part of it, I find is great. It's great for stretching. It's great for strength, and it's really good for breathing. So I find breathing really helps. It helps with anxiety. It helps and sort of as you're doing it, you're kind of picturing breathing good stuff in and exhaling kind of bad stuff. So check out some yoga videos. They're all free online. The third thing is try and get addicted, and I mean kind of obsessed with something good or something positive, right? So right now I'm reading the Game of Thrones books, which I know fits in with my nerdy thing, but and I'm sort of in my head as I'm reading, I'm kind of comparing the show that I watched and loved, like I loved Game of Thrones, kind of comparing what I'm doing or what I'm reading, in the books. But I've become kind of obsessed with it. But it's okay because I'm reading, I've got my brain active, I'm healthy, and so on and so forth. I'm just trying to stay busy. Just like yourselves, I'm in my home every minute of the day where I don't go out for a quick short run, or I have to go out sometimes for groceries, which I don't like to do, but every 10 days or so, maybe 12 days, I'm going out for some groceries. My milk and veggies and stuff goes pretty quick. Okay, so, and the last thing I will say is reach out to people. Stay connected to people. And I don't just mean text and social media. I mean, give people a call. FaceTime people. Get in touch with an aunt or an uncle you haven't talked to in a while. Talk to your grandparents. Play some board games with your family. Don't sit in your room isolated and on social media. As much as you can, contact people, right? Stay out and stay connected. You're not alone. Everyone's feeling the same thing. Anyway, I hope that this video helps. I hope that I've done you some good, and I hope that you found some value in this. Anyway, I care about you all tons, and more to come this week on the brain as we move from drug addiction and into abnormal psychology. All the best.